Hello. Today I want to talk about the recent resignation of Philip Pullman as the President of the Society of Authors. Gosh, the resignation of the President of the Society of Authors. Doesn't that sound like a storm in a teacup? Or one of those battles of the books that have amused the world since really the invention of printing, when two authors or more, others like to join in, usually obscure, fight each other to the absolute last drop of blood in their pens. Yes, indeed. But we should be alerted a little, because the Society of Authors, and indeed Philip Pullman himself, have actually tried to present what's gone on in just that fashion, as a storm in a teacup or the battle of the books, and the task of explaining it all in those terms has been left to Nicholas Solomon, who is the secretary of the Society, and as we shall see as this story unfolds, tends to play the good cop to the bad, very tough cop of Joanne Harris, who is the chair of the Society's managing committee, and very definitely not to be confused with the president, who is or was Philip Pullman. So right, let's disentangle this using the approach of Nicola Solomon. She's explained that what's gone wrong between the Society and its distinguished president is an unfortunate misunderstanding. Partly it's of course to do with the new world of communications of Twitter, which does complicate things, and on the other hand, so sort of really problem is too big a word, but a constitutional misunderstanding about the relationship between the office of the president of the Society, which is honorary and given to a distinguished figure like Philip Pullman, but of course and acts as a kind of public face of the Society, but doesn't actually do the work of managing it. That's left to the chair, also elected of the Society, that's Joanne Harris, and a management committee. And so what's needed is a little bit of constitutional adjustment, and this will take place, Nicholas Solomon explains, before the next AGM, when the managing committee will set up, no doubt, a subcommittee which will just of course be chaired by Joanne Harris, and of course will have Nicholas Solomon as its secretary, and will come up with a neat solution that will be put to the AGM, where no doubt it will be nodded through by the quiescent membership. I don't buy any of this. I think, on the contrary, absolutely fundamental issues are involved. Fundamental issues of freedom of the speech, of freedom of the press, of freedom of publishing. Publishing, again, going right back to the beginning of the book, with various not terribly successful attempts at state censorship in this country, has been essentially a free-for-all in which books, good, bad and indifferent, representing ideas, good, bad and indifferent, and very often no ideas at all, have fought each other for recognition, for a scrabbling place on the top. And by and large it's worked. But there is another view of publishing, a very different one, that publishing is a privilege, that it's to be granted only to books that embody received wisdom in appropriate language, making the appropriate gestures, censored effectively, not by state censorship, but by something much more dangerous, by the shock troops of woke, in the form of sensitivity readers, and particularly the agitation of the most junior members of staff, almost all, as I'm afraid George Orwell brutally pointed out, women. And again, I merely quote from 1984, the most extreme members of the party, the most fanatic, were women. Publishing, a female industry. Right, let's, with poor Philip Pullman as the epicenter of something different. So all of those big things, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedoms from censorship, the free exchange of ideas, has been the lifeblood, as I constantly argued, the lifeblood of the West. The thing, this moment of the clash of civilizations, the clash between freedom and authoritarianism, the thing we must cling on to is this idea of the freedom of ideas, the freedom of the press, the freedom of language. So, big things. And there's also a very personal element to this, because Philip Pullman has just resigned now in the spring of 2022 from the Society of Authors. Nearly 2 years ago now, in the summer of 2020, I resigned. I'll read very shortly from my letter of resignation, and you will see that the grounds on which I resigned then are essentially the same as the grounds which Pullman has resigned on now. In other words, I was prophetic. Unfortunately, as in the Old Testament, prophets are without honour in their own country, in their own organisations, in their own profession. But be that as it may. So what actually happened? What's going on here? Well, it all goes back to a remarkable woman called Kate Clanchey, who was a schoolmistress, a school teacher, and she recorded in a very remarkable memoir published that, in that dim and distant past, before Black Lives Matter, before COVID, back in the more or less BC, before COVID 2019. The memoir was called Some Kids I Taught and What They Taught Me. It was terrific read, splendid book. It won the Orwell Prize. It was an extraordinarily vivid, somebody who's taught myself, admittedly, only once in a quasi-school environment with the horrors of Jamie's Dream School, but somebody who taught regularly at university. You could recognise that process of the interchange, the wonderful representation of the process of the interchange between teacher and taught, that title, Some Kids I Taught and What They Taught Me, and combined with the vivid language, a warmth, a sympathy. In other words, an astonishingly worthy winner of the George Orwell Prize. But that was 2019. There then comes 2020. The year, of course, in which I resigned from the Society of Authors, the year in which I was cancelled, the year of COVID, the year of Black Lives Matter, of that extraordinary, hysterical, panic-stricken summer of 2020. A kind of, a sort of public fit of hysteria. And this by no means the first time that it's happened in British history, and it's written about and described in a magnificent turn of phrase by the great Victorian Macaulay, who talks about nothing being more ridiculous than the British public in one of its fits of morality. Well, I think what we should see is the whole reaction to George Floyd's death, the I shouldn't smile about that, should I? The whole Black Lives Matter, the whole those extraordinary riotous processions, which were carefully described as essentially peaceful protests, the whole hysteria about COVID and whatever. We should see it as one of these fits of morality. And a year later, that fit of morality caught up with Kate Clanchey. And the woman who'd been used only to praise, to winning prizes, suddenly found herself denounced as a racist and an ableist. And what was even more alarming about the denunciations, they were by 3 women of colour of, I think I'm correct in saying, Islamic extraction, or could be construed as such. What did they accuse her of? Well, I barely dare to repeat the phrases. They are so shocking, so wonderful words, racist and ableist. What had she done? She described some of her pupils, and you know how you do it as well when you're dealing with any group, particularly when you're teaching. You've got a lot of kids. I hate that word, but anyway, you've got a lot of children, 20, 30, more sometimes. You pick out particular characteristics, you home in on them, partly to remind yourself of them, to distinguish one little brat from another little brat, but also to characterize them, to give that sense of mutual knowledge, which is one of the essential bases of good teaching. And she picked them out in little phrases. They're not necessarily hugely original, but they're the sort of things that we do when we look at a group of people. One of them had a chocolate-coloured skin. Another had almond eyes. Another one, who was an Afghan lad, was short and square, and he got a big nose and a premature moustache. And then there were autistic children, behaving or misbehaving in the conventional sense as autistic children do, and she describes them in this lovely phrase as unself-consciously odd, because that's what a lot of autistic people are. But that would not do. These three sisters of systemic racism and the what is even worse, colonialism, decided to police her language and to denounce her. This is where Philip Pullman comes in. Philip Pullman, gallantly, dare one say, man standing up for a woman, denounced the people who were attacking her in this Twitter storm, and he picked on one or two phrases, and he used in return, they of course characteristically strong and abusive language, and he used strong language in return. He said people who were criticising Kate's book, it would seem without reading it, were ideal candidates to belong to the Taliban or ISIS. Which of course, as it turned out, that the attackers were people of colour, of Islamic extraction, or Middle Eastern names or whatever, of course triggered an explosion. 1,000 writers, I think it is, produce a joint letter denouncing Pullman, and one of those signing it was the managing chair of the Society of Authors, Joanne Harris. And she goes out of her way to issue a statement on behalf of the Society of Authors. Solomon and Harris issue a statement which is then elaborated by Harris, explaining that Pullman had spoken out of turn, that there was immense resentment on the part of the staff to the things that he had been saying, and so on and so on. What do Clanchey and what do Pullman do? They're now faced with the sort of storm, the sort of storm that I was faced with in July of 2020. And what you do what I did. Faced with that pressure, you back down, you curl up, you apologise. In Clanchey's case, she made terrible errors, like saying, well, she really hadn't said any of those things, and if she had, she didn't really mean them. And even Pullman, much more used to public exposure, backs off and apologises. So, 1-1 to Joanne Harris. But then the ship begins to right itself. Clanchey recovers her confidence. She denounces her publishers. She, after having said, she'd rewrite the thing to satisfy the criticism, she would acknowledge the fact that Picador, her publishers, had effectively thrown her to the wolves and said they had made the most terrible mistake in publishing this, and they would help her rewrite it. They would appoint sensitivity readers to enable her to rewrite it. Think about all that, An author is required to rewrite a book in accordance with fashionable opinion. Well, Clanchey rebels against that. She fortunately acquires sufficient confidence to leave her publishers and eventually to get a new one. And Pullman again recovers his confidence too, and after she's left Picador, he says he hopes very much that she will acquire a new publisher with better expertise and an assured sense of moral courage, which indeed he's got too, and recovered a backbone. And of course this then leads to a real effective guerrilla war between Pullman, the figurehead of the Society of Authors and the whole ethos, the structure, the position espoused by the Society of Authors itself through its secretary and more particularly through the chair of its managing committee, Joanne Harris. And that culminates, as I said last week, in Pullman's decision to resign as president of the Society. And this is what he says. When it became clear that statements of mine were being regarded as if they represented the views of the Society as a whole, although they did nothing of the sort and weren't intended to, and that I was being pressed by people both in and out of the Society to retract them and to apologise, I realised that I would not be free to express my personal opinions as long as I remained president. That being the case, with great regret and after long consideration, I chose to stand down. He couldn't exercise freedom of speech as the president of the Society of Authors. Can we just weigh that statement? He, a man of his distinction, could not exercise freedom of speech if he remained president of the Society of Authors. That there is a contradiction between freedom of speech and being president of the Society of Authors. I think we should just pause for a second there whilst I have a sip of water and we all think about the implication of that statement. Of course, I'm not the only one to raise this. Others have begun to feel something similar. Something has gone deeply and badly wrong about the Society of Authors, including, again, I've been rude about women. Let me hasten and put my hand up and say, come on, there are good ones as well as bad ones. And two of the most distinguished women in publishing, Carmen Khalil and Marina Warner, have come out both in favour of Pullman and they've come out of the Society. Carmen Khalil, of course, is the archetypal woman in publishing. She is the founder of the great feminist publishing house with that wonderful name, Virago. So if the founder of Virago can't remain within the Society of Authors, that's one index. And Khalil doesn't seem to have released a statement on it. On the other hand, Marina Warner spoke very fully to the bookseller. And she said two very interesting things. She said that the Society of Authors is there primarily to deal with the problems of writers, issues of copyright. What you're paid for doing what? Are you paid for doing a literary festival? How are you treated by Amazon? What do you do about hostile reviews? What do you do, as in my case, when a publisher sacks you arbitrarily and so on? All of these everyday bread and butter issues. And what she says is the Society, this is Marina Warner, what she says is the Society of Authors, which was founded to deal with these questions, no longer does. No longer deals with them properly. And then she goes on and she says, I'll stop putting words in her mouth. The Society of Authors, she says, are there to stand on behalf of writers and their interests, and I don't think their response to various things that have happened recently has been in the interests of writers. And then, in a rather roundabout way, she goes on to deal with these big questions, the question of the freedom of the press, the freedom, the liberty of speech, the freedom of speech. And she adds that there is a climate of anxiety amongst writers and that it was important that people did not lose their nerve. What I talked about with the first understandable reaction of both Clanchey and of Pullman to that, the avalanche, the Twitter storm, which it's again, I've been referring quite a lot, obliquely and directly, to George Orwell. A Twitter storm is the exact equivalent of a hate week in 1984. It's that storm of venom and hatred, which, as I've said before, if those launching that attack on you could actually turn a Twitter storm into a public execution, they would in a second. So it's that climate of anxiety, the fact that in the face of a Twitter storm people lose their nerve. And she then goes on and she touches the issues, including over principles such as freedom to publish and to remain published. exactly the sort of things I mentioned as being the big questions involved in this apparent storm in a teacup. Which now brings us to my resignation. Pullman's a week ago, in the spring, in March 2020. Mine, whatever it is, just short of 2 years ago, in June 2020, as I said, at the height of Black Lives Matter, the hysteria over that, the marches through London, and of course in the middle of the first really rush of blood to head over the COVID crisis. And at this moment, the Society of Authors chose to publish its support for Black Lives Matter, you know, the clenched fist, the hashtag @Black Lives Matter, the fact that silence was violence and that it was silence which only perpetuated this injustice. And when they did so, because I feel very strongly on this, which is why everything happened in the summer of 2020, when they did that, when they published their support for Black Lives Matter, I wrote to Nicholas Solomon in the following fashion, very briefly. I am writing in the strongest possible terms to dissociate myself from your message of support for BLM. BLM is a far-left organisation, open brackets, if you don't believe me, look at its website, and is profoundly hostile both to Western culture and to freedom of speech. These are the lifeblood of the writer, at least of this writer. It is, I continued, an indelible shame that a society of writers should kowtow to fashion and issue such a statement. I resign and have cancelled my subscription with immediate effect. Now, Solomon, as I said, who was very good at playing the good cop, wrote a quite extended letter saying, well, you know, she regretted my hastiness. Did I know that the particular variety of Black Lives Matter that they'd subscribed to wasn't the wicked extreme left-wing one that I was referring to? Did I know that authors of colour and publishers of colour and so on were distinctly disadvantaged within publishing, etc., etc.? I'm afraid I replied rather bluntly and said, I didn't really think that any of those things were material to the central question. So she replied, courteously but with a kind of twist of the knife, what a pity it was that I was going and wasn't staying to listen to the evidence. You know, remember that wonderful phrase of Francis Bacon about Pontius Pilate, who asked, you know, what was truth, but would not stay for an answer. And I apparently wouldn't stay to listen for the evidence. Well, Nicholas Solomon, we have the evidence. We have the evidence of Pullman's resignation, much more important than mine. That commitment of an organisation to Black Lives Matter and to that whole apparatus of systemic racism, critical race theory, colonial studies and whatever is fundamentally and absolutely inimical to freedom of speech, to freedom of thought, to freedom of publication, and to everything that a society of writers and authors should be about. Right, how do we generalise this? Well, in one sense, of course, it's an illustration of something I've been talking about on many occasions. It goes back to, do you remember the Calvin principles that I talked about? They were enunciated by the University of Chicago in yet another conflict of the 1960s about freedom of speech, and freedom of speech under attack in the American academic world at that point in two directions. In the 50s from the right with McCarthyism, in the 60s as now from the left. And what the Calvin Commission at the University of Chicago did was to say that a university is a place where, of course, there's a passionate conflict of ideas. It's a kind of perpetual tag wrestling or boxing match of ideas, but the university itself must be neutral. It is a referee and it is a boxing ring. It is not a participant in the struggle, the battle of ideas, the battle of books, the battle of ideas. It seems to me to be the absolute principle, the only principle on which a university, or as we see in the case of the Society of Authors, a learned society, or a society of those who deal in ideas, can possibly function. Individuals will have passionate but widely differing, and in the proper sense of the word, diverse commitments. The institution is there essentially, the society is there essentially to represent all of them. The only thing they have in common is their membership of the society, in this case the Society of Authors, and the problems of all authors, whatever their opinions, which is how much they are paid, how easy to get published, how do you protect copyright, what is your relationship with Amazon, what is the relationship with the internet, and all of those other kinds of things. Again, the Calvin principles, a very grand and rather abstract one. I also mentioned a much more interesting, well, not much more interesting, but a very interestingly specific and very imaginative application of those principles at Cambridge, at Caius College, Cambridge, in the very simple but highly symbolic matter of flags. And what the college has said is that individual students can put whatever they want in their windows. If they want gay pride, if they want to commemorate if they want to stick the, sure they do, the ubiquitous light blue and yellow of Ukraine in their windows, whatever, absolutely fine. But the college, as a college, will only fly one flag, which is the flag of the college. The only thing that everybody at Caius has got is being a Chian. That's all. One would hope also they might even consider that flying the Union Jack, which goes, again, one of the things that most of them will have in common is a common citizenship, but that's another story. So the idea of a commonality of a common flag, but all the particular specific flags symbolising attachment to this cause and that cause, they're individual. That only the institution represents the commonality of all of them. There's one way of approaching this, but there's another, and arguably I think more, so in other words, what the Society of Authors have done with their support for Black Lives Matter and the whole apparatus of critical race theory is they have betrayed that principle. So they produce the kind of running saw of contention, of taking sides, which forced Pullman's resignation, which is the background to the resignation of, well, I suppose, Carlyle, of Warner, and of Starkey, and one would hope many, many more. But there's another thing, and arguably it's even more concerning, because of course the Society of Authors is by no means the first society of writers, and the kind of struggles which are going on in it are by no means the first time that there have been such struggles. And I want now, quite deliberately, and I hope highly controversially, to point out the direct comparison between the Society of Authors now, in 2022, here in England, and the Union of Soviet Writers in Moscow in 1934, at the height of Stalin's terror. Now that is, I would hope, in one sense it should be an actionable statement. Fortunately, it can be defended directly as a statement of truth, as I shall now try to do. When the society, the Union of Soviet Writers was set up in 1934, it was designed, there had been previous unions of writers, of course, it was designed to take advantage of the fact that much the most distinguished Russian writer of the time, who'd been in exile, Gorky, had come back to Russia and was both handled with kid gloves and subject to immense pressure to represent himself as a good Soviet writer and to become a leading light in this new society of Soviet writers. And he wasn't actually the president of it, but when the society was launched, there was an extraordinarily interesting speech given in which the purpose of a society of Soviet writers was explained. What is a Soviet writer? What is his purpose? What is the purpose of this Union of Soviet Writers? Its speech explains it very clearly. Russia, Moscow, Stalin, 1934. Our Soviet literature is not afraid of the charge of being tendentious. Yes, Soviet literature is tendentious, the president proclaimed, for in our epoch of class struggle, there is not and cannot be a literature which is not class literature, not tendentious, allegedly non-political. In other words, the purpose of literature is governed by politics, by the ends of politics, which in 1934 was standard Marxist class consciousness, and literature must embody that. The Society of Writers, therefore, is essentially a device for managing writers, for making sure, the Soviet Trade Union of Writers is a device for managing writers and for making sure that they write the right thing in the right way according to the rules that have been perceived are known by the experts, the Marxist experts of the Conservative Party. That is Moscow, 1934. What about London now? What about the Society of Authors now? Well, in the case of the dispute with Pullman, positions weren't articulated absolutely clearly, but they were articulated clearly in another one of these battles of the books, as you probably noticed. There have been quite a lot of them. It's the battle of the books with J.K. Rowling over the whole business of trans rights and are trans women women and trans men men, and Rowling's magnificent assertion that a woman is a biological woman and cannot be anything else. You know, that whole business about when people who menstruate, when she responded to it, isn't there a word for it, women, woman, whatever. Who comes down against her? Who comes down very hard against her? Well, once again, that familiar name, Joanne Harris, who is one of the principal subscribers to the letter which sets out the contrary doctrine. And it explains as follows. Listen to what I'm going to say now and run it past in your mind what the president of the Soviet Union of Writers said. Literature cannot be anything but political. Literature has to be an expression of class struggle. This is what, drafted, I would suspect, very much by Harris, the letter says. Culture is and should always be. Look at that. The phrasing is in fact virtually identical. There is not and cannot be a literature. Culture is and should always be. We're now defining what culture is, what literature is. Russia, 1934, London now, 2022, exactly the same phraseology. Culture is and should always be at the forefront of societal change. The sentences are identical. The thought is identical. The purpose is identical. The purpose is to control, is to use literature to advance, literature and writing and thought and expression to advance a particular highly partisan view. And they then go on, these 1,000 writers, go on to say explicitly that trans men are men and trans women are women. That no writer, no real writer, and I'm sorry, I couldn't care less whether Harris has sold 1 million copies for chocolate or whatever it is. No real writer could possibly make that statement that trans women are women and trans men are men, because it betrays the use of language. This is, again, Orwell. It is Orwell's Newspeak. It is Orwell's recognition that the final triumph of the party will be when everybody acknowledges that 2 and 2 are 5. That, I'm afraid, is what the Society of Authors, managed by Joanne Harris and with the slightly subtler routine of Nicholas Solomon, has become. It has become, I suppose, a version of the Ministry of Truth. The Society of Authors has become a parody of the Soviet Union of Writers. From Moscow in 1934 to London in 2022. Can't we actually see this, as Orwell did, as a genuine fifth column? I'm afraid that's really, what it is. At a time, and as I said, the West is engaged in, for the first time in years and years, in an overt and direct struggle, well, if only it were more direct than it is, with tyranny. This is the fifth column. These are those who attack our fundamental freedoms, who risk the essence of our own, not so much society of authors, but society in general. Not simply freedom of expression, but freedom in general.